the baby who wouldn't stop crying. The afternoon sun blazed over the rolling lawns of the Blackwell estate, turning every blade of grass into a shimmering green jewel. Beneath the marble shade of white canopies, the most powerful business figures of the West Coast gathered for what was meant to be a historic outdoor luncheon, the signing of the multi-million-dollar merger that would cement Richard Blackwell's empire as one of the most dominant private conglomerates in California. Crystal glasses glinted on linen-draped tables, silverware shimmered, and servers moved quietly like shadows. Everything was perfect, or it should have been, but over the delicate notes of the string quartet, a single sound tore through the air, the piercing, unrelenting cry of a baby. Richard sat at the head of the table, his face tight, trying to maintain composure as his 1-year-old son Ethan screamed and thrashed on the polished surface of the boardroom-style outdoor table. The sound was raw, desperate, and heart-wrenching. Not the soft cry of hunger, but the guttural wail of a child in distress. Guests exchanged glances, shifting in their seats. Some tried to mask their discomfort behind polite smiles. Others, like the board's senior members, wore open irritation. This was not the place for a child, and certainly not for one behaving this way. But Richard could not bring himself to order the nanny to take the boy away. He had tried that before, many times. Each time, Ethan's screams had only grown louder until his little body trembled with exhaustion. And the guilt in Richard's chest felt unbearable. He had built everything through control, numbers, deals, strategy. There was a formula for success, a method for power. But nothing in the world could quiet his son. It had been like this ever since Emily left. His wife, his partner, the one who had once filled the house with laughter and light. 6 months ago, she had walked out after a stormy argument, leaving only a note that said, "You forgot what family means, Richard. You forgot how to love." He had thrown himself into work ever since, convincing himself that he was doing it all for Ethan, building a future, securing stability. But the truth was crueler. His son didn't need an empire. He needed his father, and Richard had no idea how to be one. "Perhaps we should postpone the presentation," murmured Margaret Lee, the CFO, as the baby's cries echoed across the manicured garden. The sound of her calm, diplomatic voice only made Richard's jaw tighten. "No," he said, his tone low, controlled but trembling at the edges. "We proceed." He reached for the boy, his expensive suit jacket brushing the crystal glasses, and lifted Ethan into his arms. The baby's small hands pushed against his chest as if rejecting him. "Ethan, please," Richard whispered, the first crack of helplessness breaking through his businesslike tone. "Just for a few minutes, son. Please." The baby's sobs only grew louder, echoing off the stone walls and reflecting the silence of every powerful person at that table. Silence that said more than words could. It was the silence of judgment, of discomfort, of watching a man who could control markets lose control over the smallest life in his care. By the edge of the infinity pool, unnoticed and invisible to the glittering crowd, a small girl paused in her work. Her name was Luna Rodriguez, 7 years old, her small figure dressed in faded jeans and a plain yellow t-shirt that had seen better days. Her mother, Carmen, worked as the estate's chief housekeeper, and Luna often helped her after school, collecting leaves from the pool or wiping down patio chairs for an extra few dollars. She was used to being invisible, to adults talking over her, to polished shoes walking past her without a glance. But she wasn't used to that sound. The baby's cry cut straight through her chest, raw and lonely, like something she had once known herself. It reminded her of nights in their tiny apartment when her mother would weep quietly over unpaid bills, pretending Luna was asleep. That same helpless, aching sound of needing comfort and finding none. Luna's small hands tightened around the pool net. She watched the crowd of adults, all dressed in tailored suits, all pretending not to hear the baby's agony. The nanny stood awkwardly behind Richard, her face pale and helpless. Luna bit her lip. Something inside her, something brave and foolish, whispered that she couldn't just watch. She looked around. No one noticed her. Slowly, she set the net down, reached into the small bag she always carried, and pulled out a tiny baby bottle filled with warm milk. She had prepared it earlier that morning for the neighbor's infant, who her mother often helped look after. But maybe it would help here too. As she approached, her sandals barely made a sound on the stone walkway. Her heart pounded as she neared the table, That huge, intimidating table surrounded by strangers who looked like they owned the world. Richard was too busy trying to soothe his screaming son to notice her at first. Then a small voice spoke, soft, trembling but clear. "Sir, may I try something?" Richard turned, blinking down at the small figure beside him. For a second, he didn't even register what he was seeing. A poor child, her hair tied back with a faded ribbon, her dark eyes steady and kind. "What?" he asked, startled. "Sir," she said again, lifting the bottle slightly. "Maybe he's hungry, maybe. He just needs someone to hold him gently." The adults at the table exchanged looks, some shocked, others amused. One of the executives muttered something under his breath, but Luna didn't notice. Her eyes were on the baby. Without waiting for permission, she held out her arms. To everyone's astonishment, especially Richard's, Ethan reached for her. The baby's tiny hands grasped at her shirt as if recognizing something safe, something familiar. She took him carefully, her movements natural, practiced. As she cradled him close and placed the bottle to his lips, the impossible happened. The cries softened into quiet sniffles. The baby's trembling stopped. He began to drink, slow at first, then eagerly. Within moments, the garden fell silent. Every gaze turned toward the sight. A poor little girl holding a millionaire's son, calming him with nothing but gentleness. The wind rustled the oak leaves, and even the music had faded away. Only the sound of Ethan's steady breathing filled the space. Richard watched, frozen. He could hardly believe it. His son, who had refused every bottle, every embrace, every lullaby, was now calm in the arms of a stranger child. "How?" he whispered. Luna didn't answer. She only smiled faintly, humming softly, a tune she remembered from her grandmother, a lullaby sung in Spanish that spoke of love and stars and home. Ethan's eyelids fluttered, his hand clinging to her shirt. Within minutes he was asleep, his head resting against her shoulder. Luna looked up at Richard and said quietly, "He was just scared. Sometimes babies cry because they don't feel safe, not because they're hungry." Her voice was small, but her words carried more truth than any psychologist's report or pediatric expert's analysis. For a long time, no one spoke. Even the board members who moments ago were irritated and impatient were now silent, watching something they could not define, but felt deeply. Richard felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in months: humility, awe, and a strange kind of shame. He realized that he had thrown money at every problem, as if compassion could be outsourced. Yet this child, who probably had nothing, had given his son what no amount of wealth could buy. "Peace, what's your name?" Richard asked softly. "Luna, sir." "Luna Rodriguez," she replied, her eyes lowering. "My mama works here." Richard nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Thank you, Luna," he said, and meant it more deeply than he had meant anything in years. Around the table, the air felt lighter. Even Margaret, who had been known for her icy professionalism, had tears glimmering in her eyes. "A child just reminded us all what real leadership looks like," she whispered. That night, long after the guests had left and the mansion had returned to its cold, echoing silence, Richard stood by the nursery door watching his son sleep peacefully for the first time in months. On the nightstand lay a small pink hair ribbon, Luna's, which Ethan refused to let go of when she'd left. Richard didn't move it. He couldn't. Somehow that simple ribbon meant more than all the awards and trophies in his study. In the days that followed, Luna became a quiet, unofficial part of the household routine. After school, she would come by to play with Ethan, sometimes feeding him, sometimes just sitting near his crib humming softly while he slept. Richard watched from the hallway, pretending to be busy but secretly listening. Each laugh, each tiny smile from his son felt like a miracle. But miracles make people talk, and soon whispers began to spread. Among the staff, among Richard's business associates, even at the country club. "The CEO's baby is being cared for by the maid's daughter," they said. Imagine the scandal. People laughed behind closed doors, but Richard didn't care. Or at least he told himself he didn't. Until one afternoon, Luna's mother, Carmen, came to his office, her hands trembling, eyes filled with worry. "Sir," she said softly, "I am grateful for what you've done, for how kind you've been to Luna. But people are talking. It could ruin her and you too." Richard turned to the window. Outside, Luna was pushing Ethan on a small swing, the baby laughing freely under the sunlight. The sound was like a balm on old wounds, For a long time he said nothing. Then without turning he said, "Let them talk." His voice was calm but firm. "She brought my son back to life, Carmen. That's something no one else could do. I won't take that away from him." Carmen said nothing, but her eyes softened. For the first time she saw not the rich man her daughter worked for, but a father who had finally remembered what love looked like. As the sun dipped beyond the mansion's edge, painting the world gold and crimson, Luna's laughter mingled with Ethan's, and somewhere deep inside the house, in the heart of a man who had thought he'd lost everything that mattered, something fragile and beautiful began to heal. The whispers in the mansion. The Blackwell mansion had always been a fortress of silence, a world of polished marble floors, measured footsteps and voices that rarely rose above polite tones. It was a house that smelled of old money and new ambition, where every room had been built to impress rather than comfort. Yet in the weeks that followed that fateful afternoon when Luna Rodriguez calmed the crying child that no one else could, the mansion began to sound different. There was laughter again, the kind that echoed through hallways like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. The staff had grown used to hearing the giggles of the baby and the soft voice of the little girl who sang lullabies in Spanish while pushing the heir to $1 billion empire on a swing tied to an oak tree. It was strange and beautiful, like something fragile reborn inside walls that had long forgotten warmth. But in a place where appearances were everything, warmth was not always welcome. The staff began to whisper in the kitchen and laundry rooms, their voices low and uncertain. Some said it was sweet, that the poor girl had brought happiness back to the house. Others muttered that it was inappropriate, even dangerous, for a maid's child to be seen so often near the master's son. People in wealth's orbit had an instinct for scandal, like moths to flame, and soon those whispers found their way beyond the mansion gates, into the country club lounges, the charity galas, and the golf courses where reputations were currency. It began with casual remarks, half joking, half barbed. "I heard Richard Blackwell's new nanny is 7 years old," one man quipped over wine. "Oh no, my dear," his wife replied with a smirk. "She's not a nanny, she's the help's daughter." "Isn't that adorable?" The laughter that followed was brittle and cruel. Within days the gossip had shape and momentum, a story retold in drawing rooms with smug sympathy, that the once powerful Richard Blackwell, now widowed by choice, was raising his heir with the help of a poor immigrant girl. It was the kind of gossip that dripped with both pity and venom. Inside the mansion, Richard was not deaf to the murmurs. He saw the glances, felt the weight of judgment from those who pretended to care for him. But whenever he saw Luna sitting cross-legged on the nursery rug, stacking colorful blocks with Ethan's delighted squeals filling the air, all the noise outside faded into insignificance. For the first time in years, he felt that something in his life had meaning beyond success. His empire had been built on numbers, mergers, and precision, but this small girl, with her simple kindness and quiet courage, had achieved what all his money and experts could not. She had given his son peace and been him a mirror to his soul, yet not everyone shared that sentiment. Carmen Rodriguez, Luna's mother, began to feel the tension in the air long before Richard acknowledged it. Servants who once greeted her politely now avoided her eyes. The head chef, once friendly, grew cold. When she walked down the hallways, conversations stopped abruptly. She understood the unspoken truth of working in rich men's homes. Affection was tolerated only when invisible. Loyalty was expected only when convenient. One evening, after finishing her rounds, she found Luna asleep beside Ethan's crib, the baby's small hand clutching her daughter's sleeve. It was such a tender sight that Carmen's heart ached with both love and fear. She gently carried Luna to her room, kissed her forehead, and sat by the window long after midnight, staring at the moonlight on the gardens. She knew trouble was coming. It always did when kindness crossed the line between classes. The next morning, the trouble arrived in the form of Charles Morrison, Richard's oldest business associate and self-proclaimed friend. He was a man of wealth and arrogance, whose words carried the subtle cruelty of someone too used to power. Over lunch in Richard's study, he stirred his coffee lazily and said, "You know, old friend, people are talking. They say you've gone soft, that your house looks more like a daycare than a CEO's residence." Richard's expression remained neutral, but his jaw tightened. "Let them talk," he replied curtly. "My son is healthy and happy for the first time in months. That's all that matters, Charles chuckled, leaning back in his chair. You've always been sentimental beneath that business armor, Richard. But sentiment doesn't play well with shareholders. It looks weak. His tone dropped conspiratorial now. And having the maid's daughter parading around your estate like a member of the family? It's not a good look. The press could have a field day with it. Richard set his pen down slowly and met his friend's eyes. Luna isn't parading anywhere. She's a child helping another child. That's all, Charles smirked, unconvinced. You can dress it up however you want, but the world doesn't care about innocence. It cares about image. You're a Blackwell. You can't afford the wrong kind of sympathy story. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Richard spoke, his voice low and steady. Do you know what's ironic, Charles? I've spent my whole life building a company that prides itself on innovation and humanity. And yet here we are, two grown men afraid of a 7-year-old's kindness. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. If the world can't handle compassion, then maybe it's the world that needs fixing, not me. Charles left, shaking his head. But his words had planted a seed, one that Richard could not completely ignore. That evening, as he watched Luna feeding Ethan, he felt a shadow of doubt. Would keeping her close bring harm to her or his reputation? He didn't care about gossip for himself, but the thought of her becoming a target filled him with unease. She was just a child, brave, pure, and undeserving of the malice of adults. Meanwhile, Luna remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. To her, the mansion had become a second home, though she never treated it as one. She still helped her mother clean, still said sir and thank you to everyone, and never took anything that wasn't offered. Her joy came from simple things. When Ethan laughed, when she saw Richard smile for the first time, when she got to sit by the grand piano and listen to the melodies that used to fill the halls when Mrs. Blackwell was still around. But one day, while she was dusting picture frames in the hallway, she stopped before a large portrait, a woman with soft eyes and a kind smile, holding baby Ethan in her arms. The plaque read Emily Blackwell, 1989 to 2023. Luna stared for a long time, then whispered, You must miss her a lot, though there was no one to hear. That night, something unusual happened. Richard found Luna sitting on the nursery floor, humming as Ethan drifted to sleep. He lingered in the doorway, watching quietly. When she looked up, she said softly, Sir, may I ask something? He nodded. Do you think he remembers his mama? The question struck him like a knife. He hesitated before answering. I don't know, Luna. I think he does in some way. She looked down at the sleeping child and said, Sometimes when he wakes up, he calls for someone softly. Maybe he remembers her voice. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard said quietly, You remind me of her. Luna's eyes widened. Of Mrs. Blackwell? He nodded slowly. She had the same heart, the same way of caring without expecting anything back. Luna looked away, embarrassed. Mama says kindness costs nothing, but it buys peace. Richard smiled faintly, repeating her words under his breath. It buys peace. But peace, as always, was fleeting. The very next day, Carmen was called into Richard's office. He looked tired, conflicted. Carmen, he began, I've been thinking about Luna, about the attention she's been getting. It might be safer for her if... But before he could finish, Carmen interrupted, her voice firm but trembling. If she stops coming here? Richard hesitated. I don't want to, but... The world can be cruel and I don't want her to be hurt by it. Carmen's composure cracked. With all due respect, sir, my daughter doesn't care what the world thinks. She doesn't even understand those words yet. She just sees your son crying and wants to help. You can't protect her by taking away the one thing that makes her proud. Her voice softened. Do you know what she said to me last night? She said, Mama, I think Mr. Blackwell's house isn't sad anymore. The words pierced through Richard's heart like sunlight breaking through fog. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he sighed. All right, he said finally. Let her stay. Let her keep being who she is. And so life continued. Fragile, delicate, and beautiful. Yet the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, spreading beyond gossip to the pages of society blogs and business rumor columns. Reclusive CEO finds comfort in company of housekeeper's child, one headline hinted. Richard's PR team panicked. The board demanded explanations. But Richard stayed silent. He didn't. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter, his son's laughter, through the grand, lonely halls of the mansion. And for the first time since Emily left, Richard Blackwell felt something he thought he had buried forever. Hope. But hope, like all fragile things, invites envy and opposition. For in the shadows of admiration and scandal alike, someone else had been watching. Someone who would soon test the limits of compassion and reveal whether Richard's newfound humanity could survive the cruelty of the world. The storm behind the smiles. The winter sun hung low over the sprawling Blackwell estate, its light soft and golden, bathing the manicured gardens in a melancholy warmth. From the outside, everything appeared serene again. The tabloids had calmed down. The boardroom meetings had resumed, and Richard had learned to ignore the hushed comments that floated through the halls of his social circle. But within the walls of the mansion, something deeper and more meaningful had taken root. A fragile peace, the kind that grows in places once scarred by loneliness. It was strange to think how quickly a child's laughter could mend what years of luxury had broken. Every morning now began not with the cold chime of Richard's phone, but with the sound of Ethan's giggles echoing down the marble corridor, followed by the musical voice of Luna calling, "Come on, little explorer, breakfast time." Richard would watch them sometimes from the study window, the billionaire and the janitor's daughter occupying two completely different worlds, yet sharing a bond that defied logic. Luna's presence had changed everything. The mansion that once felt like a silent museum now pulsed with life. She had painted color where there was only gray. Yet as much as her innocence brought light, it also drew shadows, the kind that thrive on envy, pride, and the cruel curiosity of people who cannot stand to see goodness in unexpected places. It began subtly. The house staff, once simply cautious, became divided. Some adored Luna and quietly helped her, sneaking her small snacks from the kitchen, smiling when she played with Ethan. Others grew bitter, jealous of the affection she received from their employer. One of them was Mrs. Harrow, the senior governess who had served the Blackwell family for over a decade. To her, Luna's presence was an insult, a disruption of order, a stain on the prestige she guarded so fiercely. "A servant's child doesn't belong in the nursery," she muttered one evening to the butler. "Mr. Blackwell may have lost his sense, but someone needs to remind him where the lines are drawn." Her words carried the kind of poison that spreads slowly, invisibly, until it infects everyone it touches. But Luna, innocent and unaware, continued to bring warmth wherever she went. She spent her afternoons teaching Ethan to walk across the carpeted hallway, clapping her hands with joy every time he took a step. "You can do it, Ethan. Just one more," she would laugh, her voice echoing down the marble halls. Sometimes she would bring him little paper flowers she folded herself, or hum songs her grandmother used to sing back in their old neighborhood, songs about hope and kindness, about finding light in dark places. And Richard, though he never said it aloud, had started to believe that she was sent to remind him of something he had forgotten, that compassion was not weakness, that success meant nothing if it came at the cost of connection. Yet, even as Luna's small world inside the mansion blossomed, trouble began to stir outside its gates. Someone had leaked photographs, blurry but unmistakable, of Richard walking across the garden holding Ethan, with Luna skipping beside them, carrying the boy's toy. The caption that ran beneath in the online tabloids was cruel and speculative. "Mystery girl at the Blackwell estate, the billionaire's secret." It was everything Richard had feared. The story spread faster than he could contain it. News anchors chuckled about the tender-hearted CEO, social media buzzed with conspiracy theories, and shareholders began calling the board, worried about optics and public image. When Richard saw the headline for the first time, he felt anger rise like a fire in his chest, not because of what it implied about him, but because it dragged an innocent child into a storm of adult cruelty. That evening, he called an emergency meeting in his study with his legal advisor and PR director. "I want every trace of that story gone," he ordered. "Every copy, every repost," the PR director sighed. "We can try, but once it's out, it's out. What we can do is manage the narrative, maybe frame it as a charity initiative. Say the girl is part of a mentorship program your company sponsors." Richard's hand slammed down on the desk. "She's not a project," he snapped, his voice shaking. "She's a child. And she's the only reason my son is alive, healthy, and smiling again." I won't reduce her to a headline for your convenience. For the first time in his career, Richard didn't care about reputation. He cared about doing what was right. But righteousness has a cost, and it came sooner than he expected. The next day, as Luna arrived with her mother, the security guard hesitated at the gate, phone in hand. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Rodriguez," he said awkwardly. "We were told to confirm your access before letting you in." Carmen frowned, confused. "We've been working here for years." The guard looked away, uncomfortable. "New protocol," he murmured. When they finally entered, the air inside the mansion felt different, colder, stiffer. Conversation stopped when they passed. Eyes followed them from corners. Luna clutched her mother's hand tighter but said nothing. Inside, Richard was already facing the consequences. Margaret Lee, the board's treasurer and his longtime ally, had called him early that morning. "Richard, you know I support you," she began, her tone weary but kind. "But the board is nervous. They think this situation could damage investor confidence. They're pressuring me to intervene. Please, for your sake and hers, find a way to distance yourself from that child." Those words echoed in his head long after the call ended. Distance yourself. How ironic, he thought bitterly, that the same people who praised him for leading with heart now wanted him to amputate it to protect their money. That evening, he found Luna in the garden, sitting under the oak tree with Ethan crawling in the grass beside her. She looked up and smiled, completely unaware of the storm raging above her small world. "Look, sir," she said proudly. "He said my name today." He said Luna. Her joy was pure, her laughter bright. Richard felt his throat tighten. For a moment he couldn't speak. When he finally managed to, his voice came out strained. "That's wonderful, Luna. You're doing amazing with him." She beamed, unaware that tears were forming in his eyes. He turned away, pretending to adjust his cufflinks. But inside he felt something break. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, he sat alone in his study staring at an old family photo. Himself, Emily and baby Ethan on his first birthday, before everything fell apart. He thought of what Emily would have said if she were still here. She'd always believed in seeing the soul before the status, the person before the price tag. "Don't let the world harden you, Richard," she used to say. "Money builds walls, but love breaks them." And now here he was, watching history threaten to repeat itself. The same coldness, the same fear of public opinion that had driven Emily away. Only this time it wasn't his wife's heart at stake. It was a little girl's. The next morning, the tension finally came to a head. Mrs. Harrow, the senior governess, cornered Carmen in the hallway, her voice dripping with disdain. "You need to keep your daughter in her place," she said sharply. "Mr. Blackwell may tolerate her now, but when this scandal blows up, it's your family that will be left out in the cold. Take my advice. Stay quiet. Stay invisible." Carmen bit her lip, holding back tears, but before she could reply, Luna's voice rang from behind them. "Why are you talking to my mama like that?" The older woman turned, startled, then sneered. "You should learn respect, young lady. This house doesn't belong to you." Luna stared up at her with wide eyes, not defiant but hurt. "I know it doesn't," she said softly, "but it's also not yours to make people feel small." Her words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. Mrs. Harrow turned red, muttered something under her breath, and walked away. Carmen looked at her daughter in astonishment. "Luna," she whispered, "where did you learn to speak like that?" Luna shrugged, looking down at her shoes. "Mr. Blackwell says we should never let people's words make us forget our worth." When Richard heard about the incident later that evening, he didn't scold Luna. He simply smiled and said, "Your courage reminds me of someone I once knew." He didn't mention that the person he was thinking of was Emily. Yet even as the bond between them deepened, so did the danger surrounding it. That weekend, Richard received a letter from the board demanding a formal statement about the child-related controversy. It was written in the cold, legal language of people who cared only for profit. He sat in silence for a long time after reading it, then tore the paper in half and tossed it into the fireplace. "They can take my position," he whispered, "but they won't take my humanity." Later that night, he went to the nursery one last time before bed. Luna had fallen asleep beside Ethan again, her small hand resting protectively on his back. The soft glow of the nightlight painted their faces in peace. Richard stood there, his heart full and aching all at once. For the first time in years, he knelt beside the crib and prayed, not for wealth, not for power, but for courage. courage to protect the light that fate had placed in his home. Outside, a storm gathered on the horizon, lightning flickering in the distance. It would not be long before that storm reached the mansion. But for now, inside those walls, under the quiet hum of the night, two children slept, unaware that their friendship had already changed a man, and soon it would challenge an empire. When the world turned against kindness, the storm that had hovered at the edge of the horizon finally broke one gray Thursday morning, when the mansion awoke not to the soft babble of Ethan's laughter, but to the harsh buzz of phones and the frantic footsteps of staff hurrying through hallways that had once felt peaceful. Overnight, the online gossip that had started as whispers had turned into a wildfire. Every news outlet, every social page, and every corporate blog carried the same sensational headline, each one twisting the story in its own cruel way. Millionaire CEO hides poor girl in his mansion, scandal or sympathy. Some called it charity. Others mockingly called it obsession, and a few insinuated things so vile that even seasoned reporters hesitated to repeat them aloud. Screens flashed images of Luna playing with Ethan in the garden, photographs taken without permission through the tall iron gates, sold to tabloids by someone who had traded loyalty for greed. Inside the Blackwell mansion, chaos reigned beneath the surface calm. The staff moved like ghosts, whispering in corridors, avoiding Richard's eyes. Carmen walked with her shoulders tense, her uniform perfectly pressed but her expression drawn tight with fear. Luna, however, seemed unaware of the magnitude of what was unfolding. She noticed the tension, of course, the strange way people stopped talking when she entered a room, but she couldn't yet grasp that the world beyond those marble walls was tearing her name apart. She only knew that Mr. Blackwell looked tired, that his smile had become softer but sadder, and that her mother's hand shook when she packed her lunch that morning. Richard spent that morning in his office, staring at a flood of messages on his phone. Angry investors, panicked board members, journalists demanding statements, and even personal friends advising him to do damage control before it's too late. He sat there for a long time without answering a single one, the screen lighting and dimming over and over again like a heartbeat he could no longer control. The irony was unbearable. For years he had commanded respect through authority, but now he found himself powerless in the face of lies. He could fight markets, competitors, even legal wars, but not public opinion. And the world's opinion was merciless. By noon, the Blackwell Industries Communications Department had issued a public statement without his permission. A sterile, corporate paragraph claiming that the young girl, seen at the Blackwell residence, is the daughter of a staff member and was involved in a charitable mentoring initiative. It was an attempt to neutralize the storm, but to Richard it felt like a betrayal. The statement reduced Luna's humanity to a headline, turned her compassion into a press strategy. When he read it, he felt a surge of anger so strong that he almost tore the paper apart. He summoned the PR director immediately, his voice cold and quiet. "You had no right to speak for me," he said. The man stammered something about protecting the company's image. Richard's reply was sharper than any boardroom reprimand he had ever delivered. "You can rebuild a company's image. You can't rebuild a child's heart once you've crushed it." Downstairs, Luna sat at the kitchen table coloring with Ethan beside her. She could hear the faint buzz of conversation from the adults but didn't understand why their voices sounded so sharp, so full of tension. When Carmen came in, her face pale and strained, Luna looked up and smiled brightly. "Mama, Ethan drew me a son," she said, holding up the paper proudly. Carmen forced a smile that barely held. "That's lovely, Carino," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. But in her heart, fear was coiling tighter. She had seen what happened to people like them when rumors took hold, jobs lost, doors closed, dignity stripped away by whispers too loud to silence. That evening, as twilight fell over the estate, Richard asked to speak with Carmen privately in his study. The air between them was heavy with unspoken dread. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the fading light. "Carmen," he began softly, "I owe you more than I can ever repay. Your daughter saved my son, saved me in more ways than you know. But the world—" He hesitated, searching for words that didn't sound like excuses. "The world can be cruel to innocence. They've turned something beautiful into something ugly, and I don't know how to protect her from it." Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "Please, sir, don't make us leave," she whispered, already knowing what he was about to say. Richard turned sharply, his expression pained. That's the last thing I want. But the longer she stays here, the more they'll talk. They'll twist this until it hurts her. I can't bear to see her name dragged through the mud for simply being kind. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion he'd been suppressing. If anyone should take the fall, it should be me. Carmen stood there, her hands trembling. For years she had served this family, seen the loneliness in that house, and now she saw a man torn between power and conscience. You think sending her away will protect her? She said quietly. But what will that teach her? That kindness should be hidden? That love is dangerous? She's only 7, Mr. Blackwell. She doesn't understand your world. She just sees a baby who needed her. Please don't punish her for that. Her words hit him like thunder. He wanted to believe her, but his world was ruled by consequences. He ran a hand over his face, exhausted. Maybe you're right, he murmured. But I have to find a way to stop them before they destroy what little peace we've built. That night he drafted a letter to the board, a resignation notice. He didn't send it yet, but it sat on his desk, a symbol of his defiance, his final act of independence. For the first time in decades, he was willing to lose everything to protect something pure. The following morning, when Luna came to the mansion, she found Richard waiting for her in the garden. He looked older than she remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his smile, though tired, was gentle. Luna, he said, kneeling down to her level, I need you to be very brave for me, okay? She blinked, confused. Did I do something wrong, sir? He shook his head quickly. No, not at all. You did everything right, more than anyone ever could. He paused, his voice softening. But sometimes when people see goodness, they don't understand it. They make up stories because they can't believe someone can be kind without wanting something back. And now those stories are hurting you and your mama. I can't let that happen. Luna stared at him, her eyes wide, her small hand clutching Ethan's. But I don't care what they say, she whispered. Ethan needs me. You said I help him feel safe. Her words cut through him like glass. He took a deep breath, steadying his voice. You do, Luna. You help both of us. But maybe, just for a little while, you should stay home. Until all this noise goes away. Tears filled her eyes as the meaning sank in. You mean, I can't come here anymore? She asked, her voice trembling. Richard swallowed hard. Just for a little while, I promise. She looked down, biting her lip to stop it from quivering, then nodded silently. Okay, sir. She turned and walked back toward her mother, her shoulders small and trembling beneath the sunlight. That afternoon, after they left, the mansion felt emptier than it had in years. The laughter that had once filled its corners was gone, replaced by the echo of silence that seemed to mock every step Richard took. Ethan cried for hours that night, inconsolable, calling her name in babyish sobs until he finally fell asleep from exhaustion. Richard sat by his crib staring at the moonlight spilling across the floor and felt the full weight of what he had done. He told himself it was to protect them, but deep down he knew it was fear that had driven his decision, the same fear that had cost him his marriage. Days turned into weeks. The headlines eventually faded, replaced by new scandals and fresher gossip. But the damage lingered like a scar. Richard returned to work, moving through meetings and negotiations like a ghost. Nothing felt real anymore. The only moments that pierced the fog were when Ethan pointed toward the garden and mumbled, Luna? Richard's heart broke every time. He began visiting the poorer side of town where Carmen lived, bringing groceries and quietly ensuring her rent was paid. But he never had the courage to knock on the door. One evening, after another empty dinner in the vast dining hall, he stood by the grand piano where Emily once played and ran his fingers across the keys. The sound was faint, hesitant, like a memory trying to find its way home. In that sound, he realized that everything meaningful in his life had come not from business or power, but from love, and every time he had chosen fear over love, he had lost something irreplaceable. He made a decision that night, one that would change the course of all their lives. The world could twist kindness into scandal, but he would not let it win. He would not allow a little girl's heart to be punished for what his own world had corrupted. If redemption meant defying every expectation, he was ready to pay the price. The next morning, he packed a small box of toys and Ethan's favorite blanket into his car and drove across town to the Rodriguez apartment complex. a modest brick building with cracked sidewalks and flower pots on the balconies. As he climbed the stairs, neighbors peeked out curiously at the sight of the billionaire who had built half the city standing in their hallway. He knocked softly on the door, and when Carmen opened it, surprise flickered across her face. "Mr. Blackwell?" she whispered, uncertain. He smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he'd worn in weeks. "May I come in?" Inside, Luna sat at the small table, drawing with colored pencils. When she looked up and saw him, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir?" she gasped, jumping to her feet. Richard crouched down and opened the box, revealing Ethan's favorite toys and a framed photo of the three of them laughing in the garden. "He misses you," he said quietly. "And so do I." The room was silent except for the sound of Luna's soft breathing. Then she ran forward and hugged him, the simplicity of that gesture breaking through all the walls of status, pride, and fear. Carmen stood by the stove, tears streaming down her cheeks, whispering a prayer of gratitude. Outside, the world continued its noisy march of judgment and gossip. But inside that small apartment, something sacred unfolded. The quiet redemption of hearts that refused to stop believing in goodness. Richard looked at the two of them, the woman who had taught him humility and the child who had taught him love, and knew that the empire he had spent a lifetime building was nothing compared to the family he had finally found. The legacy of a little girl's heart time has a strange way of softening the edges of pain, of turning storms into distant echoes and wounds into quiet reminders of what truly matters. The scandal that had once shaken the Blackwell name eventually faded into the background noise of new controversies and fleeting headlines. People moved on as they always do, chasing fresher stories to feed their curiosity. But inside the quiet rhythm of real lives, within the walls of a modest apartment where warmth replaced wealth, something far more lasting was being written. It was not a story of power or money, but of healing, of lessons that would echo long after the world stopped watching. Months passed, then a year, and the rhythm of their days found a gentle balance. Richard no longer lived behind the guarded gates of the Blackwell mansion. He sold it quietly, donating most of its contents to charities and children's homes. The sale made headlines for a week. Fallen CEO sells estate to fund orphanage program. But he didn't care about the speculation. For once, he wasn't trying to fix a public image. He was trying to fix himself. He had bought a smaller home not far from Carmen and Luna's apartment, in a quiet part of the city where laughter sounded louder and life felt closer. He spent his mornings walking Ethan to the park, his afternoons reading business journals out of habit, and his evenings sharing dinner with the only people who now truly mattered to him, Carmen and Luna. Luna had grown taller in that year, her once shy demeanor now replaced by quiet confidence. She had started attending a better school, thanks to Richard's help, though he never paraded it as charity. He told her it was an investment in the future kindness of the world, and she took those words seriously. Every day after school, she would visit Ethan, who ran to the door shouting her name as though she were the sun returning after night. Together they played, learned, and laughed, filling Richard's once empty home with life again. There were no marble halls now, no chandeliers or servants, just the sound of family, of people who had chosen one another not out of obligation but out of love. The world, however, never fully forgot the story. Even years later, Richard would still receive occasional calls from journalists hoping to resurrect the scandal for a feature on redemption or the downfall of the powerful. But he always declined with the same calm words. Some stories belong to the heart, not the headlines. Yet, in private, he kept a single newspaper clipping folded neatly in his desk drawer, the first one that had falsely accused him, the one that had changed everything. He kept it not as a wound, but as a reminder of what he had gained from what he once thought was his ruin, because that single cruel article had brought him to the doorstep of the only people who had ever shown him what humanity truly meant. Ethan grew into a bright, curious boy, full of life and warmth. By the time he was 5, he barely remembered the cold mansion where he was born, but he never forgot Luna. To him, she was his sister in every way that mattered. Whenever anyone asked who she was, he would answer proudly, "She's my family." That simple statement used to bring tears to Richard's eyes, though he always turned away before anyone noticed. For in those words lived everything he had once chased through power and failed to find: belonging, connection, meaning. Carmen, too, had flourished in her quiet strength. After years of cleaning other people's homes, she had finally opened a small daycare center with Richard's encouragement and support. It wasn't charity. It was partnership. He provided the initial funding, but the vision was hers. A place where working mothers could leave their children without fear, where no child would cry alone the way Ethan once had on that long-ago afternoon. She named it Little Heart's Haven. The name had come from Luna, who said every heart, no matter how small, deserved a safe place to be loved. Within a year, the daycare had become one of the most trusted centers in the community, and its story of origin, whispered quietly between parents, was more moving than any marketing campaign could ever be. Richard visited often, sometimes helping fix toys or read stories to the children. The parents who recognized him as the former Blackwell CEO would watch with quiet surprise. The billionaire who once commanded boardrooms now sitting cross-legged on a carpet, making paper animals for laughing toddlers. But to Richard, this was not a fall from grace. It was his redemption. He had climbed the highest mountains of ambition and found nothing but loneliness at the top. Here, among laughter and innocence, he had found everything he had been missing. One late spring evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and rose, Luna sat with Richard on the small porch outside the daycare. She was 10 now, her eyes older than her years but full of light. Ethan was running in circles nearby, his laughter carried by the warm breeze. "Sir," she said softly, "do you ever miss the mansion?" Richard smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not the way you think. I miss what I thought it could be, a home. It was never that. Not until you two walked into my life." Luna looked thoughtful, then smiled. "Mama says a home isn't about walls, it's about hearts that stay." He nodded, repeating the words like a prayer. Hearts that stay. As the years unfolded, those hearts stayed. Richard never returned to the corporate world. Instead, he turned his focus to building foundations that funded schools and shelters for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. He often said that every check he signed was not an act of charity, but an act of gratitude. Gratitude for a 7-year-old girl who had once walked across marble floors with a bottle of milk and enough courage to teach a man what no fortune could. Luna became his protégé, his pride. When she was 12, he attended her school play. When she was 16, he funded her scholarship for a youth leadership program. And when she turned 18, she stood on a stage at her graduation ceremony and told the story of a crying baby who taught her how love can heal even the coldest hearts. The audience had no idea she was talking about a billionaire and herself. She never mentioned names, only lessons. But Richard sat in the back row, tears glistening in his eyes, realizing she had become everything her younger self had dreamed to be: brave, kind, unbroken by the world's cruelty. Carmen's daycare eventually expanded into a network of community centers across the city, each one dedicated to the same mission: nurturing compassion. She refused to let them become commercial. Instead, she partnered with local families, turning them into shared spaces of love and growth. On the wall of the first center hung a framed photo: Richard, Luna, Ethan, and Carmen sitting together under the old oak tree, sunlight filtering through the leaves. Beneath it, in simple letters, were the words, "Where kindness begins, miracles follow." Years later, when Richard grew older and the lines of time deepened on his face, he would sometimes sit in his small garden and watch Ethan, now a young man, teaching children how to plant seeds in the soil. He would watch Luna, now a university student studying child psychology, helping her mother organize community events. And he would think of that long-ago day, the polished table, the crying baby, the uncomfortable businessmen, and marvel at how everything he thought was power had been nothing compared to that moment of pure humanity. That single act of kindness had changed the course of countless lives. One evening, as the sky turned violet and the scent of jasmine filled the air, Luna came to sit beside him, now 19 and wise beyond her age. "You look tired, sir," she said gently. Richard smiled. "Just old, my dear, but it's a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from finally living right." She rested her head on his shoulder, and for a long time they sat in silence, the kind of silence that speaks more than words ever could. Then she whispered, "You know, I still remember the first day we met. You looked so serious and Ethan was crying so hard I thought you'd never smile again." He chuckled softly, "And then you walked in with that bottle and suddenly everything made sense. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening in the fading light. You taught me that love isn't something people earn. It's something people share. Richard reached over, taking her hand gently. No, Luna, he said quietly. You taught me that. When Richard passed away years later, his funeral was not the grand affair one might have expected for a man of his status. There were no lavish arrangements, no long speeches from executives. Instead, the service was held in the garden of Little Heart's Haven, beneath the same oak tree that had once shaded their laughter. Children ran and played nearby, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of the wind. Carmen stood beside Luna and Ethan, her hand resting on both of their shoulders as they looked toward the simple wooden plaque placed beneath the tree. It read, Richard Blackwell, a man who learned that love is the greatest wealth. Luna knelt beside the plaque, tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. She whispered softly, Thank you for believing in us. Then she looked up, watching sunlight break through the branches, and smiled through her tears. Years later, when Luna herself took over the foundation and expanded it beyond the city, she often told Richard's story in classrooms and community halls. Though she never used his name, she called it the lesson of the crying baby, the story of how one moment of compassion can transform an empire built on pride into a legacy built on love. And every time she finished telling it, she would look at the children listening with wide eyes and say, You may think you're small, but even the smallest heart can heal the world if it dares to care, and in that truth lived the heart of the story, the unbreakable legacy of a little girl's heart that taught a billionaire what it meant to be human, reminded the world that kindness is stronger than reputation, and proved that sometimes the greatest miracles begin not with power, but with love given freely by the smallest of hands.